Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Larchmont Public Library and O. Henry, I'm your friendly local librarian, Frank Connelly, and it's time for a few more O. Henry stories. We'll be keeping this up through to about the 16th of August, Tuesdays at 2. Springtime a la carte. It was a day in March. Never begin a story this way when you write one. No opening could possibly be worse. It is unimaginative, flat, dry, and likely to consist of mere wind. But in this instance, it is allowable. For the following paragraph, which should have inaugurated the narrative, is too wildly extravagant and preposterous to be flaunted in the face of the reader without preparation. Sarah was crying over her bill of fare. Think of a New York girl shedding tears on the menu card. To account for this, you will be allowed to guess that the lobsters were all out, or that she had sworn off ice cream during lunch, or that she'd ordered onions, or she had just come back from a Hackett matinee. And then, all these theories being wrong, you will please let the story proceed. The gentleman who announced that the world was an oyster, which he with his sword would open, made a larger hit than he deserved. It is not difficult to open an oyster with a sword. But did you ever notice anyone try to open the terrestrial bivalve with a typewriter? Like to wait for a dozen raw open that way? Sarah had managed to prive apart the shells with her unhandy weapon far enough to nibble a wee bit of the cold and clammy world within. She knew no more shorthand than if she'd been a graduate in stenography, just slipped upon the world by a business college. So, not being able to stenog, she could not enter that bright galaxy of office talent. She was a freelance typewriter and canvassed for odd jobs of copying. The most brilliant and crowning feat of Sarah's battle with the world was the deal she made with Schulenburg's home restaurant. The restaurant was next door to the old red brick in which she hall roomed. One evening after dining at Schulenburg's 40-cent 5-course table d'hôte, served as fast as you can throw the 5 baseballs at that carnival game, Sarah took away with her the bill of fare. It was written in an almost unreadable script, neither German nor English, and so arranged that if you were not careful, you began with a toothpick and rice pudding and ended with soup and the day of the week. The next day, Sarah sold Schulenburg a neat card on which the menu was beautifully typewritten with the vivans temptingly marshaled under their right and proper heads, from hors d'oeuvres to not responsible for overcoats and umbrellas. Schulenburg became a naturalized citizen on the spot. Before Sarah left him, she had him willingly committed to an agreement. She was to furnish typewritten bills of fare for the 21 tables in the restaurant, a new bill for each day's dinner, and new ones for breakfast and lunch as often as changes occurred in the food or as neatness required. In return for this, Schulenburg was to send 3 meals per day to Sarah's hall room by a waiter, an obsequious one if possible, and furnish her each afternoon with a pencil draft of what fate had in store for Schulenburg's customers on the morrow. Mutual satisfaction resulted from the agreement. Schulenburg's patrons now knew what the food they ate was called, even if its nature sometimes puzzled them. And Sarah had food during cold, dull winter, which is the main thing for her. And then the almanac lied and said spring had come. Spring comes when it comes. The frozen snows of January still lay like adamant in the crosstown streets. The hand organs still played in the good old summertime with their December vivacity and expression. Men began to make 30-day notes to buy Easter dresses. Janitors shut off the steam. And when these things happen, one may know that the city is still in the clutches of winter. One afternoon, Sarah shivered in her elegant hall bedroom. House heated, scrupulously clean, conveniences seemed to be appreciated. She had no work to do except Schulenburg's menu cards. Sarah sat in her squeaky willow rocker and looked out the window. The calendar on the wall kept crying to her, "Spring is here, Sarah. Springtime is here. I tell you, look at me, Sarah. My figures show it." "You've got a neat figure yourself, Sarah. A nice springtime figure. Why do you look out the window so sadly?" Sarah's room was at the back of the house. Looking out the window, she could see the windowless rear brick wall of the box factory on the next street. But the wall was clear as crystal, and Sarah was looking down a grassy lane shaded with cherry trees and elms and bordered with raspberry bushes and Cherokee roses. Spring's real harbingers are too subtle for the eye and ear. Some must have the flowering crocus, the woods starring dogwood, the voice of the bluebird, to even so gross a reminder as the farewell handshake of the retiring buckwheat and oyster before they can welcome the lady green to their dull bosoms. Now, on the previous summer, Sarah had gone into the country and loved a farmer. Oh, and in writing your story, never hark back thus. It is bad art and cripples interest. Let it march. Sarah stayed 2 weeks at Sunnybrook Farm. There she learned to love old Farmer Franklin's son, Walter. Farmers have been loved and wedded and turned out to grass in less time. But young Walter Franklin was a modern agriculturalist. He had a telephone in his cow house, and he could figure out exactly what effect next year's Canada wheat crop would have on potatoes planted in the dark of the moon. It was in this shaded and raspberry lane that Walter had wooed and won her. And together they had sat and woven a crown of dandelions for her hair. He had immoderately praised the effect of the yellow blossoms against her brown tresses. And she had left the chaplet there and walked back to the house swinging her straw sailor hat in her hands. They were to marry in the spring, at the very first signs of spring, Walter said. And Sarah went back to the city to pound her typewriter. A knock at the door dispelled Sarah's visions of that happy day. A waiter had brought the rough pencil draft of the home restaurant's next day's fare in old Schulenburg's angular hand. Sarah sat down to her typewriter and slipped the card between the rollers. She was a nimble worker. Generally, in an hour and a half, the 21 menu cards were written and ready. Today, there were more changes to the bill of fare than usual. The soups were lighter. Pork was eliminated from the entrees, figuring only with Russian turnips among the roasts. The gracious spirit of spring pervaded the entire menu. Lamb, that had lately capered on the greening hillsides, was becoming exploited with the sauce that commemorated its gambols. The song of the oyster, though not silenced, was diminuendo con amore. The frying pan seemed to be held inactive behind the beneficent bars of the broiler. The pie list swelled. The richer puddings had vanished. The sausage, with its drapery wrapped about him, barely lingered in a pleasant thanatopsis with the buckwheats and the sweet but doomed maple. Sarah's fingers danced like midges above a summer stream. Down through the courses she worked, giving each item its own position according to its length with an accurate eye. Just above The desserts came the list of vegetables: carrots and peas, asparagus on toast, the perennial tomatoes and corn and succotash, lima beans, cabbage, and then Sarah was crying over her bill of fare. Tears from the depths of some divine despair rose in her heart and gathered to her eyes. Down went her head on the little typewriter stand, and the keyboard rattled a dry accompaniment to her moist sobs. For she received no letter from Walter in 2 weeks, and the next item on the bill of fare was dandelions. Dandelions of some kind of egg, but bother the egg, dandelions, with whose golden blooms Walter had crowned her as his queen of love and future bride. Dandelions, the harbingers of spring, her sorrow's crown of sorrow, reminder of her happiest days. Madam, I dare you to smile until you suffer this test. Let the roses that Percy bought you on the night you gave him your heart be served as a salad with French dressing before your eyes at Schulenburg's table. Had Juliet so seen her love tokens dishonored, the sooner she would have sought for the lethal herbs of the good apothecary. What a witch is spring. Into the great cold city of stone and iron, a message had to be sent. There was none to convey it but the little hardy courier of the fields with his rough green coat and modest air. He is a true soldier of fortune, this dentillion, this lion's tooth, as the French chefs call him. Flowered, he will assist at lovemaking, wreathed in my lady's nut brown hair. Young and cowled and unblossomed, he goes into the boiling pot and delivers the word of his sovereign mistress. By and by, Sarah forced back her tears. The cards must be written. But still in a faint golden glow from her dandelion dream, she fingered the typewriter keys absently for a little while, with her mind and heart in the meadow lane with her young farmer. But soon she came swiftly back to the rock-bound lanes of Manhattan, and the typewriter began to rattle and jump like a strikebreaker's motor car. At 6 o'clock, the waiter brought her dinner and carried off the typewritten bill of fare. When Sarah ate, she set aside with a sigh the dish of dandelions with its crowning egg accompaniment. As this dark mass had been transformed from a bright and love-endorsed flower to be an ignominious vegetable, so had her summer hopes wilted and perished. Love may, as Shakespeare said, feed on itself, but Sarah could not bring herself to eat the dandelions that had been graced as ornaments, the first spiritual banquet of her heart's true affection. At 7:30, the couple in the next room began to quarrel. The man in the room above sought for A on his flute. The gas went a little lower. 3 coal wagons started to unload, the only sound of which the phonograph is jealous. Cats on the back fences slowly retreated. By these signs, Sarah knew that it was time for her to read. She got out The Cloister and the Hearth, the best non-selling book of the month, settled her feet on her trunk, and began to wander with Gerald. The front doorbell rang. The landlady answered it. Sarah left Gerald and Dennis treed by a bear and listened. Oh yes, you would, just as she did. And then a strong voice was heard in the hall below, and Sarah jumped for her door, leaving the book on the floor in the first round, easily the bear's. You have guessed it. She reached the top of the stairs just as her farmer came up, 3 at a jump. and reaped and garnered her, with nothing left for the gleaners. Why haven't you written? Oh, why? Cried Sarah. New York's a pretty large town, said Walter Franklin. I came in a week ago to your old address. Found you went away on a Thursday. That consoled some. It eliminated the possible Friday bad luck. But it didn't prevent my hunting for you with the police and otherwise ever since. I wrote, said Sarah vehemently. Never got it. Then how did you find me? The young farmer dropped a springtime smile. Dropped into that home restaurant next door this evening. I don't care who knows it. I like a dish of some kind of greens at this time of year. Ran my eye down that nice typewritten bill of fare looking for something in that line. When I got below cabbage, I turned my chair over and hollered for the proprietor. He told me where you live. I remember, sighed Sarah happily. That was dandelions before cabbage. Or dandelions below cabbage. I know that cranky capital W way above the line on your typewriter. That makes it different from anyone in any typewriter in the world. Why, there's no W in dandelions, said Sarah in surprise. The young man drew the bill of fare from his pocket and pointed to a line. Sarah recognized the first card she had typewritten that afternoon. There's still the rayed splotch in the upper right-hand corner where a tear had fallen. But over the spot where one should read the name of the meadow plant, the clinging memory of their golden blossoms had allowed her fingers to strike strange keys. Between the red cabbage and the stuffed green peppers was the item, Dearest Walter, with hard-boiled egg. From the cabbie's seat. The cabbie has his point of view. It is more single-minded, perhaps, than that of the follower of any other calling. From the high swaying seat of his handsome cab, it looks down upon his fellow men as nomadic prodigals, of no account, except when possible, and possessed of migratory desires. He sees passengers simply as goods in transit. Be you president or vagabond, to cabbie, you're only a fare. He takes you up, cracks his whip, joggles your vertebrae, and sets you down. When time for payment arrives, if you exhibit a familiarity with legal rates, you will come to know what contempt is. If you find that you have left your pocketbook behind, you are made to realize the mildness of Dante's imagination. It is not an extravagant theory that the cabbie's singleness of purpose and concentrated views of life are the results of the Hanson's peculiar construction. The cock of the roost sits aloft like Jupiter on an unshareable seat, holding your fate between two thongs of inconstant leather. Helpless, ridiculous, confined, bobbing like a toy marionette, you sit like a rat in the trap. You, for whom butlers cringe on solid land, you must speak upwards through a slit in your sarcophagus to make your feeble wishes known. Then in a cab, you're not even an occupant. You're contents. You're a cargo at sea, and the sheriff that sits up aloft has Davy Jones's street and number by heart. One night there were sounds of revelry in the big brick tenement house next door but one to McGarry's Family Cafe. The sounds seemed to come from the apartments of the Walsh family. The sidewalk was obstructed by an assortment of interested neighbors who opened a lane from time to time for a hurrying messenger bearing from McGarry's goods pertinent to festivity and diversion. The sidewalk contingent was engaged on comment and discussion for which it made no effort to eliminate the news that Nora Walsh was getting married. In the fullness of time, there was an eruption of the merrymakers to the sidewalk. The uninvited guests enveloped and permeated them, and upon the night air rose joyous cries, congratulations, laughter, and unclassified noises, born of McGarry's oblations to the wedding scene. Close to the curb stood Jerry O'Donovan's cab. Nighthawk was Jerry called, but no more lustrous or cleaner handsome than his ever closed its doors upon the point lace and November violets. And Jerry's horse. I am within bounds when I tell you that he was stuffed with oats until one of those old ladies who leave their dishes unwashed at home and go about having expressmen arrested would have smiled. Yes, smiled to have seen him. Among the shifting, sonorous, pulsing crowd glimpses could be had of Jerry's high hat, battered by the winds and rains of many years, of his nose like a carrot, battered by the frolicsome athletic progeny of millionaires and contested fairs, of his brass-buttoned green coat, admired in the vicinity of McGarry's. It was plain that Jerry had usurped the functions of a cab and was carrying a load, or was loaded. Indeed, the figure may be extended that he likened to be a bread wagon, if we admit the testimony of a youthful spectator who's heard to remark, Jerry's got a bun. From somewhere among the throng in the street or else out of the thin stream of pedestrians, a young woman tripped and stood by the cab. The professional hawk's eye of Jerry caught the movement. He made a lurch for the cab, overturning 2 or 3 onlookers and himself. No, he caught himself by catching the cap of a fire plug and kept his feet. Like a sailor shinning up the ratlines during a squall, Jerry mounted to his professional seat. Once he was there, McGarry's liquids were baffled. He seesawed on the mizzen mast of his craft, as safe as a steeplejack, rigged to the flagpole of a skyscraper. Step in, lady, said Jerry, gathering the reins. The young lady stepped into the cab. The door shut with a bang. Jerry's whip cracked in the air. The crowd in the gutter scattered, and the fine Hanson dashed away across town. When the oat spry horse had hedged a little his first spurt of speed, Jerry broke the lid of his cab and called down through the aperture in the voice of a cracked megaphone, trying to please. Where now will you be driving to? Anywhere you please, came up the answer, musical and contented. Just driving for pleasure, she is. That's what Jerry. And he suggested, as a matter of course, take a trip around the park, lady. It'll get cool and fine. Just as you like, answered the fare pleasantly. The cab headed for Fifth Avenue and sped up that perfect street. Jerry bounced and swayed at his seat. The potent liquids of McGarry were disquieted, and they sent new fumes to his head. He sang an ancient song of killing snook and brandished his whip like a baton. Inside the cab, the fare sat straight up in the cushions, looking left and right at the lights in the houses. Even in the shadowed Hanson, her eyes shone like stars at twilight. When they reached 59th Street, Jerry's head was bobbing and his reins were slack. But his horse turned through the park gate and began the old familiar nocturnal round. When the fare leaned back entranced, and breathed the deep, clean, wholesome odors of grass and leaf and bloom. And the wise beast in the shafts, knowing his ground, struck to his by-the-hour gait and kept to the right of the road. Habit also struggled successfully against Jerry's increasing torpor. He raised the hatch of his storm-tossed vessel and made the inquiry the cabbies do make in the park. "I stop at the casino, lady? Get your refreshments and rush and music. Everybody stops." "I think that would be nice," said the fare. They reined up with a plunge at the casino entrance. The cab doors flew open. The fare stepped directly upon the floor. At once, she was caught in a web of ravishing music and dazzled by a panorama of lights and colors. Someone slipped a little square card into her hand, on which was printed a number, 34. She looked around and saw her cab 20 yards away, already lining up in its place among the waiting mass of carriages, cabs, and motor cars. And then a man who seemed to be all shirt front danced backward before her, and next she was seated at the little table by a railing over which climbed a jessamine vine. There seemed to be a wordless invitation to purchase. She consulted a collection of small coins in a thin purse and received from them license to order a glass of beer. There she sat, inhaling and absorbing all. The new-colored, new-shaped life in a fairy palace in an enchanted wood. At 50 tables sat princes and queens, clad in all the silks and the gems of the world. And now and then one would look curiously at Jerry's fare. They saw a plain figure dressed in a pink silk of the kind that is tempered by the word "forward," and a plain face that wore a look of love, of life, that the queens envied. Twice, the long hands of the clock went around. Royalties thin from their al fresco thrones and buzzed or clattered away in their vehicles of state. The music retired into cases of wood and bags of leather and baize. Waiters removed the cloths pointedly from near the plain figure sitting almost alone. Jerry's fare rose, held out her numbered card simply. "Is there anything coming on the ticket?" The waiter told her it was her cab check, and she should give it to the man at the entrance. This man took it and called the number. Only 3 Hansons stood in line. The driver of one of them went out and routed Jerry asleep in his cab. He swore deeply, climbed to the captain's bridge to steer his craft to the pier. His fare entered, and the cab whirled into the cool fastness of the park among the shortest homeward cuts. At the gate, a glimmer of reason came in the form of a sudden suspicion upon Jerry's beclouded mind. 1 or 2 things occurred to him. He stopped his horse, raised the trot, and dropped his phonographic voice like a lead plummet through the aperture. "I want to see $4 before getting any further with the trip. Have you got the dough?" $4? laughed the fare softly. "Oh, dear me, no. I've only got a few pennies and a dime or two." Jerry shut the trap and lashed his oat-fed horse. The clatter of hoofs strangled, but could not drown out the sound of his profanity. He shouted choking and gurgling curses at the starry heavens. He cut viciously with his whip at passing vehicles. He scattered fierce and ever-changing oaths and appreciations along the streets, so that a late truck driver crawling homeward heard and was abaft. But he knew his course and made for it at a gallop. At the house with the green lights beside the steps, he pulled up. He flung wide the cab doors and tumbled heavily to the ground. "Come on, you," he said roughly. His fare came forth with the casino dreamy smile still on her plain face. Jerry took her by the arm and led her into the police station. The gray-mustached sergeant looked keenly across the desk. He and the cabbie was no strangers. "Sergeant," began Jerry in his old, raucous, thunderous tones of complaint. "I've got a fare that..." Jerry paused. He drew a knotted red hand across his brow. The fog set up by McGarry's liquors was beginning to clear away. "Fare, Sergeant," he continued with a grin, "that I want to introduce to you. It's me wife that I married at old man Walsh's this evening. And a devil of a time we had, it's true. Shake hands with the sergeant, Nora, and we'll be off to home." Before stepping to the cab, Nora sighed profoundly. "I've had such a nice time, Jerry," said she. Let's see. We've time for one more. The Count and the Wedding Guest. One evening when Andy Donovan went to dinner at his Second Avenue boarding house, Mrs. Scott introduced him to a new boarder, a young lady, Miss Conway. Miss Conway was small and unobtrusive. She wore a plain, snuffy brown dress and bestowed her interest, which seemed languid, upon her plate. She lifted her diffident eyelids and shot one judicial glance at Mr. Donovan, politely murmured his name, and returned to her mutton. Mr. Donovan bowed with the grace and beaming smile that were rapidly winning for him social, business, and political advancement, and erased the snuffy brown one from the tablets of his consideration. 2 weeks later, Andy was sitting on the front steps enjoying his cigar. There was a soft rustle behind him and above him, and Andy turned his head and had his head turned. Just coming out the door was Miss Conway. She wore a night black dress of that thin black goods. Her hat was black, and from it drooped and fluttered an ebony veil, flimsy as a spider web. She stood on the top step and drew on black silk gloves. Not a speck of white or a spot of color was about her dress anywhere. Her rich golden hair was drawn with scarcely a ripple into a shining smooth knot low on her neck. Her face was plain rather than pretty, but it was now illuminated and made almost beautiful by her large gray eyes that gazed above the houses across the street into the sky with an expression of the most appealing sadness and melancholy. Gather the idea, girls. All black, with a preference for cryptid shit. That's it. All black with that sad, faraway look. And the hair shining under the black veil. You have to be blonde, of course. And try to look as if, though your young life had been blighted just as it was about to give a hot skip and a jump over the threshold of life, a walk in the park might do you good. And to be sure to happen out the door at the right moment. And, it'll fetch them every time. But it's fierce now, how cynical I am, ain't it? To talk about mourning costumes this way. Mr. Donovan suddenly reinscribed Miss Conway upon the tablets of his consideration. He threw away the remaining inch and a quarter of his cigar that should have been good for another 8 minutes yet, and quickly shifted his center of gravity to his low-cut patent leathers. Fine, clear evening, Miss Conway, he said, as if if the Weather Bureau could have heard the confident emphasis of his voice, it would have hoisted the white square signal and nailed it to the mast. To them that has the heart to enjoy it, it is, Mr. Donovan, said Miss Conway with a sigh. Mr. Donovan in his heart, cursed fair weather, heartless weather. It should hail and blow and snow to be consonant with the mood of Miss Conway. I hope you know your relatives. I hope you haven't sustained a loss, ventured Mr. Donovan. The death is claimed, said Miss Conway, hesitating. Not a relative, but one who. I will not let my grief intrude upon you, Mr. Donovan. Intrude? Protested Mr. Donovan. Why say, Miss Conway, I'd be delighted. That is, I'd be sorry. I'm sure nobody could sympathize you truer than I would. Miss Conway smiled a little smile, and oh, it was sadder than her expression in repose. Laugh, and the world laughs with you. Weep, and they give you the laugh, she quoted. I have learned that, Mr. Donovan. I have no friends or acquaintances in this city, but you've been kind to me. I appreciate it highly. He had passed the pepper twice at the table. It's tough to be alone in New York, that's a cinch, said Mr. Donovan. But say, whatever this little old town does, loosen up and gets friendly, it goes the limit. Say you took a little stroll in the park, Miss Conway. Don't you think it might chase away some of your mumbly grubs? And if you'd allow me, thanks, Mr. Donovan. I'd be pleased to accept your offer as an escort if you think the company of one whose heart is filled with gloom would be any ways agreeable to you. Through the open gates of an iron-railed old downtown park, where the elect once took the air, they strolled and found a quiet bench. Here is the difference between the grief of youth and that of old age. Youth's burden is lightened by as much of it as another shares. Old age may give and give, but the sorrow remains the same. He was my fiancé, confided Miss Conway at the end of an hour. We were going to be married next spring. I don't want you to think I'm stringing you, Mr. Donovan, but he was a real count. He had an estate and castle in Italy. Count Fernando Mazzini was his name. I never saw the beat of him for elegance. Papa objected, of course, and once we eloped, but Papa overtook us and took us back. I thought, sure, Papa and Fernando would fight a duel. Papa has a livery business in Poughkeepsie, you know. Finally, Papa came around all right and said we might be married next spring. Fernando showed him proofs of his title and wealth, and then went over to Italy to get the castle fixed up for us. Papa's very proud, and when Fernando wanted to give me several $1,000s for my trousseau, he called him down something awful. He wouldn't even let me take a ring or any presents from him. And when Fernando sailed, I came to the city and got a position as a cashier in a candy store. 3 days ago, I got a letter from Italy, forward from Poughkeepsie, saying that Fernando had been killed in a gondola accident. That is why I'm in mourning. My heart, Mr. Donovan, will remain forever in his grave. I guess I am poor company, Mr. Donovan. but I cannot take any interest in no one. I should not care to keep you from gaiety and your friends who can smile and entertain you. Perhaps you would prefer to walk back to the house. Now, girls, if you want to observe a young man hustle out after a pick and shovel, just tell him that your heart is in some other fellow's grave. Young men are grave robbers by nature. Ask any widow. Something must be done to restore that missing organ to the weeping angels and crack the shin. Dead men certainly get the worst of it from all sides. I'm awful sorry, said Mr. Donovan gently. No, we don't have to walk back to the house just yet. And don't say you haven't no friends in this city, Miss Conway. I'm awful sorry, and I want you to believe I'm your friend and that I'm awful sorry. I've got his picture here in my locket, said Miss Conway, wiping her eyes with her handkerchief. I never showed it to anybody, but I will to you, Mr. Donovan, because I believe you to be a true friend. Mr. Donovan gazed long and with much interest at the photograph in the locket that Miss Conway opened for him. The face of Count Mazzini was one to command interest. It was smooth, intelligent, bright, almost a handsome face. The face of a strong, cheerful man who might well be a leader among his fellows. I have a larger one framed in my room, said Miss Conway. When we return, I'll show you that. They're all I have to remind me of Fernando, and he will be ever present in my heart. That's a sure thing. A subtle task confronted Mr. Donovan, that of supplanting the unfortunate Count in the heart of Miss Conway. His admiration for her determined him to do. But the magnitude of the undertaking did not seem to weigh upon his spirits. The sympathetic but cheerful friend was the role he essayed, and he played it so successfully. The next half hour found them conversing pensively across 2 plates of ice cream, though yet there was no diminution in the sadness in Miss Conway's large gray eyes. Before they parted in the hall that evening, she ran upstairs and brought down the famed photograph, wrapped lovingly in a white silk scarf. Mr. Donovan surveyed it with inscrutable eyes. He gave me this the night before we left for Italy, said Miss Conway. I had the one for the locket made from this. Fine looking man, said Mr. Donovan heartily. How would it suit you, Miss Conway, to give me the pleasure of your company to Coney next Sunday afternoon? A month later, they announced their engagement to Mrs. Scott and the other boarders. Miss Conway continued to wear black. A week after the announcement, the two sat down on the same bench in the downtown park, while the fluttering leaves of the trees made a dim kinescopic picture of them in the moonlight. But Donovan had worn a look of abstracted gloom all day. He was so silent tonight that Love's lips could not keep back longer the question that Love's heart propounded. What's the matter, Andy? What are you so solemn and grouchy about tonight? Nothing, Maggie. I know better. Can't I tell? You never acted this way before. What is it? It's nothing much, Maggie. Yes, it is, and I want to know. I'll bet it's some other girl you're thinking about. All right. Why don't you go get her if you want her? Take your arm away, if you please. I'll tell you then, said Andy wisely, but I guess you won't understand it exactly. You've heard of Mike Sullivan, haven't you? Big Mike Sullivan, everybody calls him. No, I haven't, said Maggie. And I don't want to if he makes you act like this. Who is he? He's the biggest man in New York, said Randy, said Andy almost reverently. He can do about anything he wants to with Tammany Hall or any other old thing in the political line. He's a mile high and as broad as the East River. You say anything against Big Mike and you'll have 1,000,000 men on your collarbone in about 2 seconds. Why, he made a visit over to the old country a while back, and the kings took to their holes like rabbits. Well, Big Mike's a friend of mine. I ain't more than deuce high in the district as far as influence goes, but Mike's as good a friend to a little man or to a poor man as he is to a big one. I met him today on the Bowery. And what do you think he does? Comes up, shakes hands. Andy, says he, I've been keeping cases on you. You've been putting in some good looks over on your side of the street, and I'm proud of you. What will you take to drink? He takes a cigar and I take a highball. I told him I was going to get married in 2 weeks. Andy, says he, send me an invitation and I'll keep in mind of it. And I'll come to the wedding. That's what Big Mike says to me, and he always does what he says. But you don't understand it, Maggie. But I'd rather have one of my hands. I'd have one of my hands cut off to have Big Mike Sullivan at our wedding. It would be the proudest day of my life. When he goes to a man's wedding, there's a guy getting married that's made for life. Now, that's why I may be looking a bit sore tonight. Why don't you invite him then, if he's so much to the mustard? There's a reason I can't, said Andy sadly. There's a reason why he mustn't be there. Don't ask me, for I can't tell you. Oh, I don't care, said Maggie. Something about politics, of course, but there's no reason why you can't smile at me. Maggie, said Andy presently, do you think as much of me as you thought of as you did of the Count Mancini? He waited a long time, but Maggie did not reply. Then suddenly she leaned against his shoulder and began to cry and shake with sobs, holding his arm tightly and wetting the chin with tears. There, soothed Anthony, putting aside his own trouble. What is it now? Andy, sobbed Maggie, I've lied to you, and you'll never marry me or love me anymore. But I feel I've got to tell Andy. Andy, there's never so much as the little finger of a count. I've never had a beau in my life, but all the other girls did, and they talked about him. That seemed to make the fellows like him more. And Andy, I look swell in black. You know I do. So I went to the photograph store and bought that picture and had a little one made for my locket. I made up all that story about the Count and his being killed so I could wear black. Nobody can love a liar, and you'll shake me off, Andy, and I'll die for shame. Oh, there was never anybody I liked but you, and that's all. But instead of being pushed away, she found Andy's arm folding her closer. She looked up and saw his face cleared and smiling. Could you ever forgive me, Andy? Sure, said Andy. It's all right about that. Back to the cemetery for the Count. You've straightened everything out, and Maggie and I was in hopes that you would before the wedding day. Boy, girl. Andy, said Maggie with a somewhat shy smile, after she'd been thoroughly assured of forgiveness. Did you believe all that story about the Count? Well, not to any large extent, said Andy, reaching for a cigar case. Because it's Big Mike Sullivan's picture you got in that locket of yours. Oh, not bad. 3 stories for our day. Hope you enjoyed them. We've got more next week. this will keep coming, as I said, till the 16th. So once again, on behalf of Marshmont Library and O. Henry and myself, friendly local librarian Frank Connelly, have a good week and see you next time. Thanks for coming.